when it comes to Orientalists, although they deserve credit for their study of the Islamic tradition and indeed of the various other major world traditions, despite themselves being within a Western context and not necessarily connected to those traditions. Yet, despite that, it's important to note that because they come from an outsider, stranger kind of perspective, they fundamentally miss out on key details, especially within the Islamic tradition. They miss out on key points regarding, or they lack certain context. And as a result, they often make errors in their understanding of this tradition. One such misunderstanding that often arises is about the ma'qulat tradition in the Islamic context, or the inclusion of the rational sciences within the broader religious curriculum of the various religious institutions in the Muslim world. Now, of course, this isn't to say that the Muslim traditionalist perspective or the other perspectives are perfect or that they get all things right. And Orientalists have done a lot of good work researching the development of the tradition, of course, and they do have very important contributions. But there are, of course, key points where they go wrong or they make quite blatant errors, in fact, because of the fact that they're not connected to the tradition or they come from an outside perspective. And so it's important then to obviously correct these incorrect notions, but it's also important to more broadly contextualize the development of the religious tradition within the Islamic world. One such misconception that often arises is that the study of the rational sciences, especially let's say within Mughal India, was primarily done for bureaucratic purposes or for bureaucratic training, to train religious scholars to fill roles of lawyers, administrators, and governors. This is an argument, for example, forwarded by Francis Robinson, not Francis Bacon, Francis Robinson, in his book The Ulama of Rangi Mahal and Islamic Culture in South Asia. Now, to be fair, Francis Robinson does approach the Islamic tradition in an impartial, unbiased manner, and he does present this more as a sober observation of the tradition rather than out of any malice or enmity towards it. But there is still a quite severe misunderstanding here, one that will obviously misrepresent the reason as to why these religious science, these sort of rational sciences within the religious curricula were studied. Although, of course, these sciences served to sharpen the intellect, sharpen the mind, cultivate rational faculties, it wasn't simply because of bureaucratic purposes that these sciences were studied. Rather, we have to contextualize the fact that these rational sciences were considered very important parts of a religious scholar's training. The reason to study metaphysics, logic, and philosophy was primarily to form a foundational worldview in which to logically and systematically prove the soundness of religious belief and the soundness of the broader religious system as a whole. Now, of course, many people may then disagree and say that, religion may not necessarily be rational or other kinds of objections. Others may assert that the foundation of religion is rational, that belief in God, for example, is rational, and then what stems from that obviously is part of that broader system that builds upon that rational basis. Whatever your perspective, though, on this matter is, the point is that for religious scholars, the emphasis on studying rational sciences was a religious one. It wasn't merely a bureaucratic or political one. And hence, to miss out that important piece of context is a very big and gross misunderstanding of the development of the Islamic tradition. Because if we study, the early works, let's say, of the Ash'aris, for example, or the Maturidis, or, of many of the traditionalists that embraced the study of rational theology, despite the objections of other traditionalists to it, one of the main reasons that they gave was that faith cannot be built upon blind following. Faith, as in the fundamentals of religion, have to be based on rational and scriptural proofs. And hence, religious scholars went to great lengths to build a philosophical, metaphysical, and logical system based upon which rational proofs for these foundational matters of creed could be given. And so this emphasis can be shown to be not merely a bureaucratic one, although it did serve bureaucratic purposes as well, but it was primarily a religious one. And it was one where there was a certain kind of religious virtue attached to the study of these sciences. And of course, this sometimes is also not necessarily a conscious thing that Orientalists do. It's sometimes the result of back projecting, both on a historical perspective, but also on an ideological perspective. The idea may be that, well, how can these religious scholars subscribing to superstition or religion possibly engage in the rational sciences or engage in rational study for the sake of it? Yet this is a very naive study of history, because although the terminologies used or the specific modes used may be different, fundamentally speaking, these scholars did understand their studies to be a fundamentally rational endeavor. And hence, whilst Orientalists, their contributions and their research is very important, it's also important to note the blind spots and the errors that Orientalists may fall into, and the gross oversimplifications and exaggerations they may make about the tradition.